The young boy looked ahead in terror as a horde of zombies moved toward him. Luckily, he had a machete in his hand to barely defend himself, but, due to his small size, he could only swing wildly at the zombies in front of him. In the next second, Laurent stumbled and fell while trying to dodge the zombies. Seeing the zombies about to lunge, all he could do was frantically back away. Just then, the zombies were suddenly pulled back by a mechanism. It turned out to be a false alarm. After securing the ropes, Daryl picked up his spear. In fact, it's only been 2 weeks since Daryl returned to the nest, and he trains Laurent with zombies every day. Since battle experience could only be gained in real combat, Daryl had to ensure Laurent could protect himself. After all, Judith and the others had learned these skills at an early age. Laurent was very satisfied with his life now. The nest did indeed provide abundant resources, but more importantly, Daryl staying gave him a real sense of home. At that moment,
Laurent! Laurent, t'es en retard pour ton cours de philo.
Je suis obligée d'y aller.
Lozang insiste. And you should head back as well. Lozang would like to speak with you.
All right.
Laurent gathered everyone in the Nest Chapel for a meeting. Just now, news came from the Paris division that their camp had been attacked, and 3 people were captured by Janet's forces: Martin, Falou, and Emile. Sylvie was filled with anxiety upon hearing the news Emile was her boyfriend. Isabelle quickly added that these were the very people who had helped them escape Paris, hoping the Nest could figure out a way to help.
Mathis, your scouts are on the way.
I hope to have a report soon.
And until then what? We do nothing.
C'est lui.
We have to save them.
We will. We need to be patient.
Patience won't work. Janae can't get anything from him. She'll just kill him.
Lo Zhang's face stiffened. No one had ever publicly contradicted him like that. He quickly promised to do everything possible and then hastily dismissed the meeting. As everyone was leaving with heavy expressions, Daryl was stopped by Lo Zhang. With his smile now gone, Lo Zhang asked Daryl how long he planned to stay here. Daryl thought Lo Zhang might be testing him, so he straightforwardly replied that he'd leave when the next opportunity arose. Unexpectedly, Lo Zhang had a condition this time, saying, "I can help arrange your route, but you must agree to one thing. Stop training Laurent to kill zombies. This child is destined for great things and shouldn't be distracted by these matters."
More than staying alive.
Yes, actually. Maintaining empathy. I worry about the impact of repeated violence on him, no offense.
None taken.
Everyone here has a place, if they choose to seek it out. I hope you'll find yours here too.
Daryl understood Lo Zhang thought his approach was too violent and criticized him for potentially leading the kid down a bad path, but it had been 13 years since the apocalypse began, and teaching kids how to fight zombies was only a precaution. Different ways, different views. Daryl didn't feel like explaining further and simply walked away. 5 minutes later, Daryl, still puzzled, found Isabelle and recounted what Lo Zhang had said. Isabelle didn't see any issue with Daryl's training. Giving a kid some self-defense skills seemed perfectly normal. However, she also thought Lo Zhang might have other reasons. Perhaps Daryl's talents were being underutilized by spending all his time with the kid. Daryl realized he might have overthought it, but he could clearly feel that he didn't quite fit in here. Maybe he should try to do something to integrate better. Hearing Isabelle's opinion that this was a good place to live, Daryl shifted the topic, saying he'd been thinking a lot lately about his family and friends far back in America, wondering how they were doing. If Daryl knew that Carol was on her way to find him, who knows what he'd feel. The next day, Daryl took the initiative to go to the training room. Lo Zhang was sparring with 2 men, showcasing impressive combat skills as he easily took down his sparring partners. Seeing Lo Zhang free for a moment, Daryl took the opportunity to state his intentions.
Heard Mathis got word back.
Janae's transporting them from Maison Mère to another facility in a few days. Mathis's team will intercept the transport.
Lo Zhang looked troubled and said, "I understand you want to help, but the Union of Hope advocates peace and opposes violence." In other words, he didn't want Daryl's involvement to escalate the fighting. Daryl replied that he felt the same. He wouldn't resort to violence unless necessary. Seeing that Daryl didn't catch his subtle hint, Lo Zhang specifically showed him the wooden staff he held. He used this staff to practice Aikido purely for self-defense, never for harming others.
But you want to punch back?
There's a time and a place for everything.
Since Daryl hadn't picked up on his indirect refusal, Lo Zhang finally agreed to Daryl's request. He had also heard that Daryl's combat skills were exceptional, and perhaps Daryl could even become a main force in the team.
Care to go around?
Not with that toothpick.
After a long pause, Lo Sung realized Daryl was only joking and nodded in farewell. Daryl, pretending to be casual, took another look at Lo Sung. This leader, with his roundabout way of speaking, was far less straightforward than he appeared. 2 days later, Daryl joined the team as they arrived at a village and spread out to find ambush positions. Team leader Mathis walked over, checked the time, and began explaining the battle plan. The first vehicle coming through would trigger a roadside bomb, blocking the convoy behind it in the alley. Then, they could launch an attack and rescue the hostages. Daryl listened and nodded, indicating his agreement. Then, they waited for Janet's convoy to arrive. Time sped by, and a teammate signaled that the convoy was about to arrive at the battlefield. Soon, 3 cars come to the intersection. Unexpectedly, Janet happens to be sitting in the first car. Everyone was poised to strike, but
it didn't blow. We should have watched. What are you doing?
before Mathis even finished speaking, Daryl opened fire, and with the third shot, he killed the driver, continuing his assault. Only when the first vehicle lost control and flipped over did Daryl signal his teammates to charge in. The sudden start of the battle caught both sides off guard. Seeing the soldiers fall, the team rushed toward the transport vehicle, startling the people inside. Mathis quickly said that they were all from the Union of Hope. At that moment, Daryl suddenly felt he'd missed something, but with the primary goal being to rescue the hostages, they had to move quickly. As Daryl reached out to help the next person, he noticed that Fallu was already injured, his face filled with terror, likely the result of torture while in captivity. As Daryl helped Fallu toward the car, he finally remembered what he had overlooked. He hadn't checked whether the people in the first vehicle were dead or injured. Just then, someone staggered beside the car. It was Janet, her head bloody from the crash. Yet laughing maniacally, Daryl raised his gun and moved forward. This was a perfect chance to kill Janet. Daryl didn't care about what she was saying. He just wanted to put a bullet in this woman. Janet even struck a defiant pose, unfazed by the gun pointed at her. When Daryl came back to his senses, he was instantly stunned. There was no longer any trace of Janet by the car. For a moment, he thought it was all an illusion. Meanwhile, Jacinta approached Lo Sung and urged him to hold the ceremony early. Since Laurent had arrived at the nest, they should announce the coming of the savior to everyone, but Lo Sung insisted they still needed to wait. As Laurent wasn't yet prepared, Jacinta was frustrated, feeling that Lo Sung was always hesitant on this issue. Once they elevated Laurent, the Union of Hope would attract more followers, and they could handle the next steps themselves. Yet Lo Sung still refused, since as soon as the ceremony took place, Laurent would gain significant authority, and they couldn't be certain he would side with them. Laurent, of course, had no knowledge of the ceremony plans. He just felt happy with life here. All the residents cared for him, and he wanted to help turn this place into a wonderful family.
Ils sont revenus.
Laurent ran eagerly toward the entrance, the sound of the bell signaling Daryl's return. The vehicle soon came to a stop in the open area, and Sylvie approached with hopeful eyes, embracing her long-separated boyfriend tightly, though Emile stared blankly, showing no reaction to her concern. At that moment, Laurent rushed out to meet Daryl, and they returned together, laughing and chatting, relieved that the mission had gone relatively smoothly. In between his studies, Laurent wished Daryl could teach him how to throw knives. Lo Sung was puzzled when he heard this. Did Laurent really want Daryl to stay? Lo Sung started to lecture on religious principles, but Laurent was clearly distracted. Laurent honestly replied that Daryl had things to teach him. Lo Sung paused for a moment but ultimately let Laurent go, surprised that Daryl had ignored his warning and continued teaching Laurent about fighting.
Il repartira un jour, Daryl. Qu'est-ce qu'on fera alors si Laurent veut partir aussi?
Daryl finira bien par se laisser convaincre. Il y a des gens qui ont besoin de temps.
Du temps, n'en a pas.
Jacinta, one of the nest's highest-ranking members, held authority second only to Lo Sung. Her insistence on holding the ceremony early stemmed from growing unrest within the Union of Hope. Many followers felt they weren't being protected, and after being attacked by Janet's forces, they were left to passively wait for rescue. If this continued, people would abandon their faith and wouldn't fight for the Union of Hope. Only the Savior's appearance could restore morale and secure the Alliance's control. This time, Lo Sung was persuaded. He looked out the window at Laurent and Daryl, silently consenting to Jacinta's plan. In the previous episode, Ash decided to go to France with Carol. Due to a sudden change in the weather, they left the base at night. Their plane skimmed over the mountains, trailing smoke, and luckily landed on a nearby field. Carol and Ash climbed out of the cabin, ready to take a short break here. Since there was a minor issue with the fuel line, Ash planned to find some tools to make repairs.
Getting over my surprise. We're still alive.
Just as he finished speaking, Ash's expression suddenly changed. Several zombies were approaching from not far away. It must have been the noise from the plane that alerted them. Carol suggested they split up. Ash would stay to fix the plane, while she'd take up arms to eliminate the zombies. The zombies seemed to move slowly, maybe due to the vegetation growing on them. Carol raised her crossbow and skillfully landed a shot to a zombie's head. Although this wasn't Carol's usual weapon, fighting alongside Daryl for so long had made her quite familiar with using a crossbow. Soon, only one zombie was left. Carol calmly lifted her hand. Suddenly, a zombie burst out from the grass. Carol quickly drew her knife to stab it, only to be grabbed from behind by another zombie that had emerged. Seizing her wrist, Ash heard the commotion and rushed over to help Carol, freeing her from danger, but he himself got caught by a zombie. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, leaving them both stunned. They looked in the direction the bullet came from, spotting a woman on the mountaintop who had just lowered her gun and was now waving to them. Soon, the two groups joined up and introduced themselves. The woman with short hair introduced herself as Hannah. She was the one who had just saved Ash with her shot. The woman with curly hair was named Un, and she was the leader of the camp. They had heard the roar of the plane and followed the road, surprised to find it had landed in that patch of wild grass. That area was full of mutated zombies. During their dormant period, the zombies would blend with the vegetation, then ambush any living creatures that passed by. Like carnivorous plants, they were also curious why Carol and Ash had flown in, as they hadn't seen outsiders for years. Ash quickly explained.
The crack in the fuel line is more like a nightmare for us.
You think you can fix it?
Yeah, it's nothing but a patch-up job. Shouldn't be too hard if I can find the right supplies.
I'm sure we've got something you'll be able to use. There.
After another half hour, the group finally arrived at the camp. Hannah and Un casually lowered their guns, leading Ash and Carol inside to rest. They hadn't expected to find such a large skull boiling in the pot. Carol was taken aback, and Ash quickly averted his gaze. When Un mentioned finding repair materials, Ash snapped out of it and nodded, ready to follow her to the storage room. Carol stayed behind alone. Hannah warmly invited Carol to make herself at home. Carol set down her weapon and started casually exploring the room. Standing next to a pile of lab equipment, Hannah picked up some homemade liquor and invited Carol to have a drink. Carol smiled and said she'd try it in a bit, then wandered over to a storage cabinet. Seemingly intrigued by life in this place, Hannah heard this and put down her glass, saying they were all climate research PhD students who had come to this camp to track glacial melting. Originally, they only planned to stay for 3 months, but when the apocalypse hit, they were trapped here.
To be like it's Mother Nature fighting back. Never screw with somebody's mother.
Carol didn't dare to respond further. She found Hannah's thought process a bit hard to digest. Just then, Ash returned, bringing with him a perfectly preserved roll of tape.
You want some help? Sure.
Carol and Ash suddenly felt something strange, but since the others didn't seem to mean them any harm, it was likely just a well-intentioned warning. As Ash and Un left the room, Carol suddenly asked for a drink. Hearing this, Hannah readily agreed, and the two began to chat again over their drinks.
You mind? Not if you're careful.
Hannah immediately reached for the crossbow, bringing it close to herself and examining it carefully. She seemed quite curious about how the weapon worked, and even loaded the arrow she had been toying with earlier. Carol's sense of foreboding grew stronger and stronger, watching as Hannah set the crossbow on the table. Carol gripped the metal all tightly. Hannah slowly turned the crossbow, aiming it in Carol's direction, her expression blank-faced as she stared at Carol. Just an hour earlier, Ash and Un had returned to the plane's landing site. On the way, they discussed his and Carol's purpose for flying to France. Carol was going to search for her daughter, but Ash was troubled. After so many years in the apocalypse, the chances of a child surviving were incredibly slim. He didn't know how to tell her the truth, yet despite the odds, he had set out for France with her, determined to take that faint chance. Un was clearly moved by his courage. After a moment of silence, she asked if he had any children. Seeing Ash's expression of regret and guilt, Boone quickly set her gun aside and embraced him. Half an hour later, Ash was working on repairs to the plane, with Oon standing nearby, watching.
You ever thought about having more?
Or what?
Children.
Ash thought Oon was joking. When he turned to look at her, he realized she was earnestly waiting for an answer. With a serious expression, he shared his true thoughts, saying he didn't believe this apocalyptic world was suited for bringing new life into it.
Humans would die out like we were never here. That's what Hannah wants, for civilization to end.
Ash looked at Oon in confusion, wondering how his thoughts had suddenly escalated to the question of human extinction. Oon said that she and Hannah had different views. She believed that human civilization should be preserved and continued, so she wanted Ash to help her. Ash snapped back to reality, hardly able to believe his ears. He felt that he must have misunderstood. Ash couldn't think of anything other than absurdity. He just felt that his values had been impacted. After a long pause, he directly refused, but Oon's expression instantly turned fierce. She had already told him there was no one else around, so why couldn't this man just listen? Ash took a deep breath, found an excuse, and said that the plane was already repaired. To his surprise, Oon lowered the hunting rifle and aimed it at him. Meanwhile, back at the camp, Carol felt helpless, as Hannah still wouldn't put down the crossbow. She had no choice but to keep chatting, hoping to understand the reason behind this. "If you don't want to kill me, then why are you so set on fulfilling your friend's wager?" she asked. But Hannah replied that she had always followed Oon's instructions, and besides, this was also helping fulfill Oon's wish. Carol took the opportunity to ask,
You must want something. I do. You can come with us. You're just saying that to save your life. I'm offering you an opportunity to save yours. Now, how often does a plane land outside of the shithole?
Hannah just shook her head, saying she and Oon had to rely on each other, but it was clear she was wavering. Seeing this, Carol promised her, "Let's go find Ash together. Once he finishes repairing the plane, we can leave here, and you'll be free to do whatever you want."
Hannah? At the plane, he's fine.
Just listen. Shut up!
Do what I goddamn tell you, I do it myself.
Hannah broke down in tears, gasping for breath as she struggled to calm herself. Carol looked back, shaken. This turn of events was completely beyond anything she had expected. An hour later, as night began to fall, Carol and Hannah reached the plane's landing site, keeping their weapons close as they guarded against zombies lurking in the thick fog. Carol felt sorry for Hannah. She had been trapped in this oppressive environment for so long that it seemed to have affected her mind. Now that Oon was dead, the only chance Hannah had to survive was to leave this place. The plane was parked not far away, but they had no idea what Ash's current situation was. Carol turned back in shock. Seeing Ash standing by the plane holding a flare gun, Carol was momentarily stunned. The flare hit Hannah in a fatal spot. She had no chance of survival. Watching the flames gradually die out, Carol could only turn and walk away. Ash looked just as shaken, allowing Carol to help remove his handcuffs. The plane took off smoothly, accelerating away from this place. They tacitly did not mention what had just happened. Carol also hid the truth about Hannah, though Hannah didn't deserve to die. To Ash, she was an accomplice, and Carol didn't want to add to his burden. It was best to let things return to normal. Daryl's team successfully rescued their comrades, but after enduring interrogations, they were left mentally and physically scarred. Emile, especially, seemed unresponsive even to his girlfriend's concern. The next day, Sylvie took Emile to the garden to get some sun and give him a haircut to lift his spirits. However, there was no joy in the reunion of this young couple. Instead, they seemed unusually distant. Emile's heavy expression persisted, and he refused to talk about what he'd gone through, no matter how Sylvie pressed him. It wasn't until Sylvie started anxiously searching for wounds under his shirt that Emile finally reacted.
J'ai fait un pacte avec Dieu pour qu'il me ramène à toi.
Et il t'a entendu. Il nous a entendus tous les deux.
On the other side, Laurent was feeling frustrated. He had just started relaxing and playing for a bit when he was called back to class. Daryl had been keeping an eye on Laurent's state, so he brought out a baseball to help Laurent relax. But recently, for some reason, Laurent's classes have become very intensive. Daryl didn't see the need to push Laurent so hard. Some of these lessons were simply too advanced for him to understand, and without comprehension, there'd be no real learning or belief.
Guess you question things. You're skeptical.
Who am I then? They're like us.
What does us mean? In a week or two, whenever you figure out a plan, you'll be gone and we'll stay here.
Daryl fell silent after hearing this. In truth, he and Isabel had feelings for each other, but bringing such feelings to light would mean taking on the responsibilities that follow. After some careful consideration, Daryl tentatively spoke up.
You can make a different choice. You could come with me. Both of you.
The next morning, Isabel woke up early to rouse Laurent from the neighboring room, but after knocking for a long time with no response, she pushed the door harder. Laurent was gone from his room, chairs were toppled, and the window was open. There had clearly been a struggle. Realizing Laurent was in danger, Isabel quickly turned to seek help. Daryl soon arrived and rushed into the room to look for clues. A rope was hanging from the windowsill, and traces of sand nearby indicated someone had entered and taken Laurent away. Just then, Jacinta arrived at the scene with a guard. 10 minutes later, everyone gathered at the gate, readying themselves for the upcoming fight. Jacinta handed a few shells to the soldiers. Daryl casually took the long gun and then accepted the rounds, loading them into the barrel. Meanwhile, the injured Fallou insisted on joining the mission. Emile immediately tried to dissuade him, but Fallou was determined to do his part, slipping past him and getting into the vehicle at the back. Sylvie saw that her boyfriend's condition had improved, so she took off her necklace and put it on Emile. Just then, Isabel walked over, armed and ready. The vehicles quickly started up and prepared to set off. Laurent stood beside Jacinta, watching Daryl and the others drive away with a serious expression. Half an hour later, the convoy passed through a forest, when one of the soldiers in the backseat knocked on the door and pointed to the bushes, saying he saw something. Before the car even stopped, he jumped out and picked up an empty fuel canister by the roadside. Daryl walked over, carefully examining the ground. It looks like 2 or 3 people stayed here briefly, then left along the path ahead, to gather more clues. They had no choice but to proceed on foot and check out the situation. Soon, Daryl's team arrived in front of a building, where they hid behind cover to observe the situation. At his signal, everyone stood up, determined to avoid alerting the enemy as much as possible. As soon as they entered the front door, they heard movement above, and then a shadow flashed by. They had been detected, but it was inevitable. Daryl patted a teammate's shoulder, signaling him to follow and block the adjacent corridor, while the others spread out to search. Isabel and Emile remained at the entry point to guard the only way in or out. Daryl held his rifle up as he cautiously made his way up the stairs. Fortunately, there were no traps at the stairwell, and upstairs there were only some large machines placed around. Daryl thoroughly checked each corner, while his teammate followed with his gun raised. But Daryl didn't notice that the 2 men were slowly pulling out the daggers at their waists. The bullets turned out to be blanks. Realizing this, Daryl quickly used the butt of his gun to hit one man's head, then dragged him toward the window. Hearing a scream, Fallou immediately took cover against the wall as his opponent charged forward with a drawn knife. Fallou shot down the nearest attacker, but another leaped at him, and they instantly grappled. Meanwhile, Daryl was also fighting hand-to-hand, slamming his opponent into the wall by his collar. At that moment, an archer aimed at Daryl from the stairs. Daryl quickly pulled his opponent in front of him to take the arrow, but he had no time to dodge the next shot. Isabel stepped out from a corner, and Daryl quickly thanked her before continuing up the stairs only to find another person waiting at the top. Isabel glanced at the woman at her feet and called out to Daryl, saying she'd seen this person before in the stables at headquarters. This meant the enemies in the building were imposters, and they would have to be doubly cautious. Before long, Isabel and Daryl reached the top floor. As soon as Daryl peered around the corner, an arrow was shot at him. As the archer was loading another arrow, Daryl charged forward, with Isabel close behind, firing her gun, but the bullet didn't hit any vital spots, and the man on the ground still tried to resist, but Daryl's blow was purely out of anger. Today had truly pushed him to the brink first. His ammunition was switched out, and then his teammates suddenly betrayed him. If Isabel hadn't insisted on coming along, he might not have made it out alive. But Daryl and Isabel couldn't figure out why the Union of Hope had gone to such lengths to set them up. There was no time to dwell on it. They still had to check on the others. Fallou was in rough shape. His injuries hadn't fully healed, and within moments he was tackled to the ground by a man who then grabbed him by the throat. The man raised his dagger, ready to kill him, and Fallou could only struggle desperately, trying to fend him off. Just then, Emile approached from a short distance away. Fallou immediately shouted for help, begging Emile to shoot, But strangely, Emile showed no intention of helping him. Falou couldn't hold on much longer. Using his last bit of strength, he grabbed an arrow from the ground and stabbed it into the man's neck. With the immediate danger over, Falou took a long moment to catch his breath and get back up, only to find Emile pointing a gun at him. Daryl and Isabel had no choice but to lower their weapons. They asked Emile why he was doing this. Seeing that the rest were all acquaintances, Emile hesitated for a long time before finally revealing the truth. The Union of Hope feared that Laurent might leave with Daryl. If the Union lost its symbol of hope, it wouldn't be long before it fell apart. So the leadership had decided to eliminate Daryl. The plan was foolproof until Isabel and Falou insisted on coming along, but they were still confused. They had once been through life and death together. How could Emile betray them so suddenly? Emile was still a young soldier, and after facing life and death, his thinking had grown extreme. He believed that the current killing was all for the success of the Union of Hope. As long as the Union of Hope ceremony went forward tomorrow, everyone would believe that Laurent was the savior.
That he represents a future where we can no longer be hurt by les affamis.
They're gonna test him.
Tomorrow it will be proven he will not succumb to the bite. And all doubt will be dispelled.
It turned out that this was the Union's real purpose. All they needed was someone immune to the zombie virus. The role of savior was just a symbolic image, created to spread the message among the followers. Emile seemed to waver as he learned the truth. Falou seized the opportunity to urge Emile to turn back, but a hand reached down and picked up the gun before Emile could. It was Isabel, the closest one. Daryl quickly raised his gun, staying alert. Emile, realizing there was no way out, accepted his fate with calm. He held the pendant Sylvie had given him, waiting for release.